Welcome to Presence, a global conversation for a new earth.
And hello, everybody, and welcome to Presence. I am Doug King. Happy to be with you today as we record this in January of 2022 for those of you that are listening currently, and for those of you who are wondering when this subject and the content in it was being discussed. It's here as we're beginning the year 2022. And as I said in the newsletter, the discussion today, the topic today is disruption. And I made reference to a book called Rethinking Humanity. The authors are James Arbib and Tony Seba. They are analysts who have worked with military, they've worked with Fortune 500s, and they've done analysis of the changes that can be expected as we move into the next era of human history. And they are significant, and they show the data and the analysis behind that. And basically, they are looking at 5 fundamental sector disruptions that are happening right now. Now, why in the world am I talking about that? I'm talking about it because the Presence message has been calling attention to the fact that theology is not a religious discussion. Theology is a transformational, evolutionary discussion. That theology is a study about the nature of that which the biblical narrative calls God, meaning it's the story about our very nature and the source of all things, and therefore the nature of all things, from the physiosphere to the biosphere to the noosphere, meaning the realm of consciousness, thinking. So these guys who have been at this now certainly very heavily the last couple decades, and they list the number of things that they predicted at the beginning of the 2000s that have now taken place, and their point is they have taken place far more quickly than the institutions predicted that were and have been in control since the advent of the Industrial Revolution. That there's a tremendous change going on here that is causing tremendous disruption. And what I'm going to be talking about as I go through the Presence message is that this nature of evolution, which is God nature, is very inclusive and necessary to disruption. And that in fact, I'll be talking from the narrative as I conclude this today, to give credence to the universal principle that is behind all disruption. These guys are saying that when you look at the 5 sectors of information, energy, transportation, food, and various materials and how they're produced, all of these are being disrupted at an unprecedented speed and scale. And that the implications of this are absolutely profound. As a matter of fact, they make this statement: we are on the cusp of the fastest, deepest, most consequential transformation, I like that word, transformation, of human civilization in history. A transformation every bit as significant as the move from foraging to cities and agriculture 10,000 years ago. When people possibly ask you the question, how in the world could we have gone this many centuries and no one understood that all the things related to the coming of Jesus were fulfilled already, that the role and function of what has been known worldwide, globally, as the church, that you're saying it only had a first century application. How in the world was that missed? How did people not see this? Who are you to say that we should look at a story differently? And what you realize right away, immediately, is that your thinking is causing a great disruption. We'll talk more about that as I go along. They say the 2020s, this decade, will be the most disruptive decade in history, and that COVID has simply pulled back the curtain on the fragility of our current models that involve the way we use these 5 sectors. So behind all of this, why I bring it up, is consciousness. All of the things that are bringing about these 5 sectors have to do with a consciousness that has evolved initially when the Industrial Revolution happened. You had movement, for example, from a horse and wagon in transportation to the horseless vehicle, the automobile. And that was a tremendous disruption. At the beginning, no one could imagine that someday the automobile, and later larger and larger vehicles, trucks, etc., would completely transform the transportation industry. And if I lived back then and I saw the wagon trails that went across communities and even one had to take to get from one part of the country to another, and I looked at these little flimsy first iteration automobiles, I'd say, well, that's never going to happen. It can't happen. Those things won't hold up. There was no one on the planet at that time, even the automakers, who could ever imagine the network, the interconnected network of interstates, that there would be highways and superhighways, and it would make the horse and wagon obsolete. And this is a principle of disruption. When you are part of a movement that is disrupting long-held viewpoints, you're in the minority. You are not only in the minority, but you will be under criticism. That criticism may be a simple write-off of your ideas as crazy. You're crazy. Now, if you're in the world of religion, depending on the background you come from and how fundamental that background was, you may be called things like apostate, heretic, etc. Disruption comes with tremendous resistance from those who hold the power and control of the current systems, models that have been in place and that have been the only way that we've understood that these things could happen. So when they get into this, some of the language they use, I'd like to just convey that and show that these analysts that are talking about transformation, even though they're talking about technology and energy and all the things that we'll talk a little bit about, it's the same principle. It's the very same principle of the disruption of the message that we see that has gone against the prevailing church Christian worldview. And these analysts say that the prevailing production systems are going to shift away from a world built on coal, oil, steel, livestock, and concrete to a world of photons, electrons, DNA, molecules, and qubits. That, in fact, design and development is going to be performed collaboratively over information networks. Look at the change that COVID brought about. How many Zoom meetings have you been involved in the last couple years? Some of you far more than others, but look, I never used technology like Zoom that much. I was in video technologies for years, but we began to realize that we could do a lot of different things collaboratively by staying right where we were geographically and using networks of communication. That's what we're doing right now. You're listening to a podcast. And I don't even know what country you're in as you listen to this podcast, because when we check the statistics over time, I think we counted up around 30 different countries that have looked at either videos we've done or podcasts we've done. And of course, the board ourselves. I mean, we have different continents: Australia, Africa, Europe, North America. We have different countries here in North America. We've got now Dave Levine. We've got Canada and the U.S. So truly, our tagline, a global conversation for a new earth, is not only theological, but it has found its way into our everyday lives of how we buy food, what kind of energy we use, and how much it costs us for that energy, just like how much our food costs, just like how much information costs and transportation. All of these things represent an all in all God, meaning an all in all nature of the universe in which we live, and which source is that which the narrative calls God. So, another quote from their book says, "This new creation-based production system will be far more equitable, robust, and resilient than any we have ever seen." Now here's the part of that phrase that jumped off of this page to me. The very beginning of their sentence, what do they say? This new creation. Does that sound familiar, that language, new creation? Well, these guys are analysts. They're talking about energy. They're talking about transportation and technology and so forth. What's that got to do with the biblical narrative? The concept of new creation goes all the way back to the Great Disruption, which is the centerpiece of the biblical narrative. Jesus, Paul, and all the apostles recognized that they were living at a time when the disruption was so great, that a completely new creation was coming into being. And Paul literally uses new creation. And within that new creation, he said, it will be made up of new creatures. What are new creatures? They're the ones who have become early adopters of this message of change. New creatures making up a new creation. Jesus and Peter and John will talk about a new heaven and a new earth. That's a new creation. That's new creation language. And what we're talking about here today is disruption that's happening on a global macro scale. That is not to minimize whatsoever disruption that can happen on a micro scale in your very life that can traumatize and cause pain and suffering, possibly to the degree where you even go to therapy to get help to heal from the disruptive event that happened in your unique life that you experienced that perhaps others have never experienced or only a handful would ever understand what you personally have experienced. That has happened on a micro, will always happen on a micro level. But what they're saying is regarding a macro level. And of course, that macro level includes all of us as individuals. That this is a unique time, just as we have seen the first century was a unique time in history. COVID has been a real eye-opener to all of us in that it has been a disruption on a macro level, and isn't it interesting that COVID manifested a disruption on a macro level at the exact same time in history when analysts are saying we human beings have evolved consciously to a place where we are ready to make an evolutionary leap, and a great disruption is in progress in these main sectors. And COVID has been a global conversation. I talked to Robert, our board chair over in Australia, and we can talk about COVID, family, friends, implications, how it has changed education and work, and you know what I'm talking about because I can have this same conversation with any of you that are listening to this right now, and we'll be on the same page when we talk about the disruption of COVID, because now we're talking about a macro. Now, when you get into energy and transportation, food, and you start talking about a disruption to the existing macro systems, you're going to have great resistance. Because if the power and profitability of the existing systems is threatened, then resistance is what we could expect. Now, some of those companies may become adopters of these disruptive technologies and systems that are producing for us food on a much better scale and in a much better way than we're doing it now, in eliminating energy costs that we pay for, and really improve the quality of life is what they're saying. So much so that instead of being enslaved to our everyday vocations and lives and working just to keep our head above water, they're saying that humankind is about to enter into the age of freedom. Again, look at 2,000 years ago. What is the message? It is a message that moves humanity from bondage to freedom. What is the bondage? What is the source of the bondage? Self-centeredness. Self-centeredness. What is the solution? Something that benefits all. On behalf of all did Jesus live. On behalf of all did his followers live. This is then a universal principle on a macro level that we're experiencing right now, and the disruption, which will be accompanied by chaos, that all of us are experiencing is absolutely necessary. It was experienced in the very first century. If, in fact, we go back to that, one of the earliest things that I learned from my dad that was going to be extremely disruptive was when we sat down and he went through Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21 with me and presented a completely different paradigm of eschatology and the coming of Christ and the judgment day and resurrection of the dead and all these things. And did it cause disruption? Yeah, it caused some disruption. Have you, as you adopted these things, gone through some disruption? Yes. And what did Jesus tell us about the disruption? He said, this is what you can expect when a new creation that's absolutely going to provide freedom and a more abundant life, he called it. Here's what you can expect. Mother will turn against daughter. Father will turn against son. There will be great persecution. You'll be delivered up to these higher powers that have been in power all along, and you'll be subject to some very difficult things that they may put you through. You may lose friends. You may lose family members. People may look at you and say that the things you teach are absolute heresy and apostasy because they're holding on to a paradigm that is now under control and in control of the thinking that we have used that has brought us to this point. The thinking of the past was absolutely necessary in the sense that it was the best next thing that human beings discovered, just as we will go forward from here and continue to evolve, continue to transform. But there are times in history when the macro transformation brings about a global disruption. And as I think about that saying, it's not what you look at, it's what you see, we're looking at the same narrative. But boy, are we seeing something different. One of my favorite stories, I've mentioned it in past podcasts, is the story of Israel moving from one world of bondage into this new world flowing with milk and honey, metaphorically. But before they entered that world, they decided to send out the 12 spies. And as most of you know who are very familiar with that story, when they came back, 10 of the spies were saying, here's what we see. This is what we see. We see giants in the land. We see, in other words, threats. We see difficulty. We see everything going down the tubes. But there were two, Joshua and Caleb, who said, no. Here's what we see when we look at that land. We see a land of milk and honey just as was promised. And so you have two different interpretations while looking at the same thing. It's easy to get caught up in times of great upheaval and disruption and even want to throw up your hands and give up. This was why the book of Hebrews was written. It's the very same principle that we're experiencing today, and the Hebrew writer is exhorting the people, do not turn back, don't turn back. And that became more and more difficult the longer people endured within their short span of life rejection, and they weren't necessarily seeing the changes happen quickly enough, and they were having difficulty holding on until those new changes came about and manifested. This is why Peter wrote in his second letter that there were many that were saying, where is the promise of his coming? 2 Peter 3. Where's the promise of his coming? Because everything remains the same as it was since the days of the fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Nothing's changed. We still go to temple. We still do animal sacrifices. We still have a high priest. We still have Day of Atonement. Everything's the same. And Peter was encouraging them that within their micro experience of individual living, within their generation, said Jesus, there was going to be a challenge of holding on, of continuing on, because a great manifestation was about to happen. And when Jesus said this would be accompanied by the fall of your religious symbolism, the temple, not one stone would be left on another. And this is the other point that they hit in their analysis, and that is, this is not a modification of transportation and energy and food and technology. This is not a modification. We've modified, and it's brought us to this place, and it's now become, as the spiral calls it, unworkable. Disruption is far more than just deconstruction. This is not just railing against what's wrong and spending all of our time and focus on what's wrong or why these people are wrong or why this interpretation is wrong. The disruption comes from people on the periphery who are coming up, high school kids they talk about, the colleges, and the research that's being done, and they're coming up with solutions. The present's message is that all of the solutions to a future of universal God identity lie within the narrative itself. We, as human beings, have always had the potential to do amazing things, but we had to evolve and grow to get to some of the things that we experience today. We've had to grow and evolve to get to a place where we could really see the depth of Jesus and the apostolic writers, a depth that I believe is so much greater than we have seen, because we couldn't. It wasn't time. We hadn't evolved in our understanding enough. But now things have become so unworkable that great changes are coming about, and we can see that. At the same time, the great changes can be very scary to the instinctual self that always seeks safety and stability. That's its job, and it's a good thing. But I watched an interview with Deepak Chopra talking to Arbib and Seba about this very book. And Deepak said, yes, what you're describing is actually not a modification, it is a death and resurrection, to which the analysts agreed. The very core principle that we have discussed theologically, meaning nature of God-wise, is the very principle that they use, the very language they use to describe the amazing disruption that's taking place and that is about to bring about amazing changes that most of the planet cannot even imagine at this time. Why? Because that's the way it works. From the one to the many, not vice versa. Paul explains it works from the one to the many. We are excited to be in a global conversation, and in the near future, I've got a couple more podcasts and some announcements to make and some people that are going to be involved in our presence conversations on a global level as we continue to tie together a God that's all in all, God in technology, God in transportation, God in all these things, education, finance, economies, that is the story of the biblical narrative, not a story of which denomination you should attend one day a week. So, thanks for joining me today. If you do get the book, I'm always interested to hear your feedback, your ideas, and many of you send those things to me from time to time, and I really appreciate hearing from you. I really appreciate the fact that I have so many of you to have conversation with. It makes for a very inspiring journey when you've got so many others that are side by side with you in it. We're with you all wherever you are right now, and we're glad that you have joined us. And I hope you have a great week out there wherever you are, and we'll see you in the next podcast.
Thank you for joining us today. If you have any questions or comments, please contact us at info@presence.tv. You can also visit our website at presence.tv or find us on Facebook. We look forward to hearing from you.